Most outlaws of the Old West, those bandits that American frontier history has so thoroughly romanticized, lasted less than 2 years in the criminal life, and when captured, nearly all of them confessed that the reality was far worse than they had ever imagined. In this video, you're going to live the first 24 hours in the skin of an outlaw in the American Old West, and understand why the outlaw life was a nightmare of hunger, fear, and betrayal, with no glamour whatsoever. Survival in the Old West was brutally different from everything Hollywood has built up, and the day-to-day life in the Old West for these men had nothing adventurous about it, just the dangers of the Old West that the movies never show. And it all starts the moment you make the wrong choice and realize there's no going back. William Bonney was 18 years old when he committed his first murder. It was September of 1877 in the Arizona Territory, and what started as a fight at a workers' camp ended with a man dead on the ground and a young man on the run forever. Decades later, when historians traced the early days of Billy the Kid's criminal life, what they found was not a romantic hero riding toward the horizon with contempt for danger. It was a terrified teenager sleeping with one eye open, who had no idea what he'd eat the next day and had just closed off every last possibility of a normal life. But what drove a man to become an outlaw in the Old West? Contrary to what Hollywood films keep insisting on showing, most didn't choose that life out of ambition, a thirst for adventure, or a desire for power. What the Old West was actually like in practice was far more sordid than any screenwriter would be willing to admit. Extreme poverty, the near-total absence of opportunity in territories that still lacked any consolidated legal structure, and the everyday violence that made crime a survival exit for many, not a choice of freedom. According to historian Robert Utley, author of Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, a large portion of the young men who entered the criminal life in the territory of New Mexico and surrounding regions came from families torn apart by the Civil War, by the misery of the Great Plains, or by the land dispute violence that defined the American frontier of the 1870s and 1880s. Picture the concrete situation. You're in a small settlement more than 100 miles from the nearest town. There's no telegraph available to most rural communities. There's no bank holding your money, no job waiting for you the day after tomorrow, and the county sheriff lives 2 or 3 days' ride away. In a moment of rage, desperation, or just plain bad luck, you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. You kill a man in self-defense or in the heat of an argument, take part in a stagecoach robbery, help a friend steal cattle from a ranch. And suddenly, within a matter of hours, everything changes in ways that cannot be undone. The first feeling that takes over isn't relief, it isn't excitement, it's pure panic, the visceral, physical kind that doesn't ask permission. According to memoirs gathered by historians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including accounts held in the archives of the U.S. Marshals Service, the first instinct of virtually every fugitive was exactly the same: run. Run far, run fast, run without any set direction and without any plan at all. The problem is that running without a plan across the American West was, in most cases, a slow death sentence, not necessarily from the immediate pursuit, but from the relentless geography of the frontier that few men knew how to cross on their own. Crimes in the Old West had one immediate consequence that no film ever seems willing to show honestly. They instantly turned you into an enemy of everyone. Not just the law, but the ordinary citizens who became potential informants motivated by reward money, the ranchers whose horses and supplies you'd need to steal to survive, the saloon owners who could recognize your face and turn you in for a modest sum, and even other criminals who could hand you over at any moment if it meant a reduction in their own sentence. In an instant, you stopped being a person with a name and a history and became simply a head with a price on it. And the Old West was very good at turning valued heads into financial opportunities for whoever happened to be nearby. The first hours of this new reality are the most chaotic, confusing, and terrifying you've ever lived through. You have no plan, no guaranteed hideout. No idea whether word of the crime has already spread through the area or whether there's still a window before any organized pursuit gets underway. You don't know if you can trust the only man who spent the night with you. And, most overwhelming of all, you are genuinely scared. The kind of fear that makes your hands shake uncontrollably, your stomach turn hard, your mouth go dry in an instant, and your mind race so fast that no single thought can complete itself. Billy the Kid spent the first days after his first crime wandering through the Arizona territory, barely sleeping, eating whatever he could steal from barns and abandoned storage sheds, swapping horses whenever he found a fresh animal to keep from being tracked, and living in a constant state of alert that any modern psychology scholar would recognize as an acute trauma response. And he was one of the most adapted to the wildlife of the frontier. For most men who became fugitives without preparation or experience, it was even worse. And that started proving itself in very concrete ways within the first few hours. The smell of gunpowder is still in your clothes. The leather of the saddle creaks with every gallop as you flee across what seems like an endless horizon of dry grass and open sky, but which in reality exposes you as a lone, completely visible dot on a flat carpet of prairie. The sharp wind of the American frontier whips your face and chaps your lips until they crack, and the first thing your body demands, with a brutal and non-negotiable urgency, is water. The physical reality of the outlaw life in the Old West began asserting itself within the first hours of flight with a quiet, systematic cruelty. The vast majority of fugitives in the real West, very different from anything Hollywood has ever been willing to portray with accuracy, fled without adequate provisions. In the heat of the moment, with no time to plan, and with adrenaline masking any logical thinking, a man would mount the first available horse and ride. And in a territory where the next water source could be 30 miles away or more, that was frequently the start of a physical nightmare well before any direct confrontation with the law. According to records from the Chisholm Trail and frontier traveler accounts compiled by historian Walter Prescott Webb in The Great Plains, a man doing physical work at moderate intensity in the hot climate of the Southern American territories needed at least a gallon of water a day just to keep his body functioning at a basic level. And a horse pushed at an escape pace needed twice that. A fugitive who left without water planning would leave his animal exhausted and dehydrated in less than 12 hours of hard riding, literally killing his only means of fast transportation and his greatest ally in the entire survival operation. But water was just the beginning of a list of problems that grew with every passing hour. Hunger in the American West wasn't a figure of speech or a dramatic detail to move the audience. It was a relentless physical reality with direct consequences on physical performance and decision-making ability. A man in constant flight couldn't afford to stop at an establishment to eat without exposing himself. Every face that saw you was a potential informant with concrete financial motivation to act. According to estimates from historians who specialize in frontier life, a man doing high-intensity physical work and fleeing on horseback for hours was exactly that, could need somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day to maintain the minimum performance necessary. What most fugitives managed to eat in the first hours of flight was, in practice, close to nothing. Nat Love, the cowboy and formerly enslaved man who became one of the most genuine and well-documented figures of the real West, described in his 1907 autobiography what it meant to spend days on end on horseback without adequate food. The subtle dizziness that arrived by the end of the first day, the growing mental confusion that set in by the second, the obvious weakness in the legs when trying to walk or mount on the third. And he was a man deeply accustomed to the demands of the hard frontier life, with years of experience driving cattle along the Goodnight-Loving Trail and the Western Trail. For a fugitive, without that physical conditioning and that history of progressive hardening, collapse could come much sooner. Then there was the problem of the horse, and it was a problem with real life or death weight to it. In Hollywood films, Old West heroes ride animals that seem tireless, biological machines capable of galloping for hours on end without any visible fatigue. The reality of survival in the Old West was radically different. A horse at full gallop burns out in less than 30 minutes of sustained running. The viable pace for long distances was a controlled trot, which still required regular rest stops, access to grazing, and, above all, plentiful water. A fugitive who pushed his animal too hard would find himself on foot in the middle of nowhere within a few hours, in a situation exponentially more dangerous than any human pursuer would pose at that moment. That's why many historically documented fugitives stole fresh horses from farms and ranches along the way, not out of any elaborate strategy, but out of basic, immediate physical necessity. And every additional theft added a new crime to the tab, a new family with a concrete reason to report you, a new witness with your face in their memory, a new complication in the growing maze of problems you had just entered. All of that before the first 6 hours of your new life. In the films and series that have defined the popular imagination of the Old West, wanted, dead or alive posters appear as dramatically powerful cinematic props, large, cleanly printed, nailed to a central board while the sheriff examines them with a determined expression. The camera slowly closes in on the face of the fugitive, a detailed and recognizable illustration with the reward value in huge lettering. It's a scene audiences recognize immediately, and it is almost completely an invention of popular entertainment with very little connection to the historical reality documented in the archives of the era. The truth about crimes in the Old West and the real systems of capture was far less cinematic, and for a real fugitive, far more terrifying precisely because it was completely unpredictable. First, the speed of information. In a territory without telephones and with telegraph available only in larger cities and along the main railroad lines, how did word of a crime reach rural communities and the people responsible for keeping the law? Through horse messengers, through travelers who carried information from one settlement to another as a natural part of road conversation, and through the telegraphs of connected cities that distributed alerts to outposts. But that means that depending on where the crime happened and what communication resources existed in the area, the news could spread within a matter of hours or take days to reach certain territories. And while it spread in a fragmented and uneven way, you were a wanted man that some of the people around you didn't yet know they were looking for, which created a constant paranoia. Every farmer you encountered could be the first to know or the last. You simply had no way of knowing, and there was no way to calculate the risk with any precision at all. The real wanted posters, preserved in historical archives like those of Wells Fargo and the U.S. Marshals Service, were frequently simple documents, printed at local print shops with rough equipment, containing vague descriptions like white male, medium height, dark hat, scar on left arm, riding a bay horse. There was no photograph in the overwhelming majority of cases. Photography was expensive, technically complex, and rarely available in an urgent context. The imprecise description could fit dozens or hundreds of other men in the region. This created an uncomfortable paradox. The inefficiency of the system could help you pass through checkpoints without being recognized, but it also meant that anyone could suspect you and act on their own initiative. There was still another equally unsettling side to this dynamic. Law and order in the Old West did not function like the centralized, organized police structure we know today. The county sheriff had geographically limited jurisdiction and resources that were frequently insufficient to mount extended pursuits beyond his borders. Federal marshals were few in number and overwhelmed with enormous territories. And the bounty hunters were legally ambiguous figures, motivated exclusively by money and not by any sense of justice, who could bring a fugitive in dead or alive, depending on what was most convenient at the moment and in the terrain. For a man in the first hours of flight, that scenario created a threat map that was impossible to decode. Law and order in the Old West wasn't an organized and predictable force like a modern police battalion. It was a chaotic ecosystem of agents with deeply different motivations, operating without any effective central coordination, which meant that the pursuit could come from any direction, at any moment, from anyone, and the line between an ordinary, unarmed citizen and an active enemy was invisible to the naked eye. Jesse James understood that dynamic better than virtually any fugitive of his generation. For nearly 16 years of criminal life, he and his gang survived not because they were stronger or faster than the law, but because they moved constantly between different territories, changed identities frequently, used the myth built around his name to create intentional confusion about his real location, and cultivated an active network of sympathizers in rural communities who sheltered them out of political loyalties that went back to the Civil War. But even Jesse James reported, according to biographer T.J. Stiles, in Jesse James' Last Rebel of the Civil War, that there were nights when the fear of being found was so intense and physical that he could barely sleep or think clearly. And he was one of the most experienced and prepared of his generation. You, in your first 24 hours, were none of that. Not yet. The distribution of technical, practical, and physical elements that made the outlaw life practically unsustainable went far beyond the obvious. One of the most overlooked and one of the most revealing about what the real Old West was actually like was the concrete relationship between fugitives and the weapons they carried. Not as symbols, not as status, but as physical weight, mechanical problem, and constant source of anxiety. Gunfights in the Old West, as popular imagination represents them. Two men squaring off on a dusty street, the dramatic countdown, the simultaneous draw timed to the millisecond, the precise shots that decide fate, were events so rare in historical reality that they became memorable exceptions precisely because of that rarity. In Hollywood films, that scene is the dramatic core of the Old West. In actual historical records, it's an occasional and wildly overrated curiosity. Bill O'Neill, systematically analyzing more than 500 documented armed confrontations between 1866 and 1900 in Encyclopedia of Western Gunfighters, concluded that the average distance of real gunfights in the American West was less than 10 feet. There was no epic duel of timed draws. There was panic, extreme confusion, multiple weapons firing in closed or semi-dark environments, and whoever fired first with any level of competence tended to survive, regardless of any special talent cultivated through years of training. Most men who went armed in the American West carried a gun, not because they had special training or an innate talent for combat, but because the weapon was a mandatory part of basic survival equipment on the frontier, as functional as a hunting knife or a pair of sturdy leather boots. The Colt Army .45 revolver, the Winchester repeating rifle, and the double-barrel shotgun were working tools, not symbols of personal power. And like any precision tool, they required constant practice and regular maintenance to work with even the minimum expected efficiency. Practice that most rookie fugitives simply did not have. The actual physical weight of the armament was also something the films conveniently ignore. A Colt 6-shooter weighed approximately 3 pounds unloaded. With the leather holster, the belt, and loaded cartridge loops, you were adding a constant weight at your hip that during hours of hard riding became a source of discomfort that progressively harder to ignore. In the midday heat of the Texas Territory or the Arizona Plains, with temperatures that historical climate estimates suggest could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the hottest seasons, the metal of the gun would heat up to the point of burning skin on contact, and the leather of the holster would swell with accumulated sweat. Oh, and there was something else the films never show. Mechanical problems with guns were common and always happened at the worst possible moment. Firearms of the 19th century were not the reliable, industrially standardized equipment that modern cinematic productions suggest. They were instruments of handcrafted precision, some of excellent quality, many of dubious quality, subject to failure with an uncomfortable regularity. Environmental moisture, the ever-present dust of the dry prairies, the sweat of hands on the grip, sand in sensitive mechanisms, all of it could make a revolver jam at the moment of greatest need, fire accidentally in a careless instant, or simply refuse to function when the situation demanded it. Keeping a gun clean, lubricated, and functionally reliable in a scenario of constant flight without access to proper tools was work that consumed precious time and required technical knowledge that many fugitives simply did not have. Wyatt Earp, one of the most experienced and technically competent marshals of the Old West, who survived more documented armed confrontations than virtually any contemporary, used to tell anyone who would listen that the real difference between a capable shooter and a dangerous amateur wasn't the speed of the draw. It was the ability to maintain physical and mental calm under extreme pressure. According to accounts preserved by Stuart Lake in his biography of Earp, in a real confrontation, the hands shake almost uncontrollably, peripheral vision narrows dramatically, and fine motor coordination is compromised by an elevated heart rate. Those who can recognize those reactions and work within them shoot accurately. The overwhelming majority, even those with some prior experience, simply miss at distances that would seem ridiculously short in a calm situation. For you, as a rookie fugitive at midday in your first 24 hours, that meant an uncomfortable truth. The gun on your hip was far more useful as a tool of psychological deterrence than as an effective weapon of actual combat. And if you reached the point of a real confrontation, your chances of survival depended far less on any shooting ability and far more on the hesitation, the mistake, or the bad luck on the other side. Bass Reeves never lost a fugitive he went after. Over more than 3 decades of service as a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Indian Territory, the region that today corresponds to the state of Oklahoma, Reeves captured more than 3,000 fugitives and killed 14 men in direct confrontations, having survived several armed ambushes. He was a formerly enslaved freedman who had learned to read the territory during years of survival on the plains, spoke 5 different native nations' languages fluently, and had the singular ability to convincingly disguise himself as a farmer, a traveling preacher, or even a wanted fugitive in order to approach his target without being identified until the exact moment of capture. What made Bass Reeves so relentless as a representative of law and order in the Old West was exactly the set of factors that made the life of any fugitive a long-term nightmare. He knew the territory with a depth that no man on the run could ever hope to acquire quickly. He knew where every stable water source was across a vast area and could position himself there to wait with infinite patience. He knew the most obvious escape routes and blocked them before even formally beginning the pursuit. He understood, from experience accumulated across hundreds of cases, that a desperate man makes psychologically predictable decisions. He goes where he imagines he's safe, seeks out familiar faces, always chooses the path of least apparent resistance, and tends to return to places where he's been before. The predictability of desperation was the experienced pursuer's greatest tool. The figure of the Old West sheriff, so caricatured in entertainment productions as a slow-moving man with a rusted star and little real determination, was in reality one of the most pragmatic and socially embedded professionals on the American frontier. The county sheriff was elected by the local community, which meant that, unlike any passing fugitive, he knew every farm, every back trail, every family with their secrets and alliances, and every personal history of the region he'd been patrolling for years. He didn't need to be faster than you in a foot race. He just needed to understand where you were headed and get there first, with more resources and with the entire local social network on his side. According to records from the US, Marshall's Service, the capture rate of fugitives in the American West during the 1870s and 1880s was surprisingly high for anyone who imagines that the vastness of the territory made escape simple and viable. Not because the law was technologically superior or numerically overwhelming, but because the informant network was vast, directly and financially motivated, and highly efficient in practice. Every merchant, rancher, innkeeper, or saloon owner knew there was concrete financial compensation for whoever reported the passing of a wanted man. Law and order in the Old West functioned, in large part, through that informal economy of information, and it was an economy that operated almost entirely in favor of the law. For a fugitive in the first hours of the afternoon of his first day, that had one devastating implication. Every person you saw on the horizon was a potential informant with real and immediate motivation to act. Every necessary and unavoidable stop, a farm to get water for yourself and the horse, an apparently abandoned ranch to rest the animal before it simply stopped functioning, was an exposure that could reach the sheriff's ears more quickly than any direct pursuit could manage. The lawless life of the Old West, that widely romanticized concept that films sell as synonymous with absolute freedom, was in practice a form of total social isolation with progressively more severe consequences. You couldn't trust anyone with the confidence needed to act freely. You couldn't ask for help openly without revealing who you were. You couldn't use your real name in any human interaction. Every encounter was a risk equation with variables you didn't control, and the wrong side of that equation was a rope around your neck or a bullet in your back. Pat Garrett, the sheriff who eventually tracked down and killed Billy the Kid in July of 1881 at Fort Sumner, described the process of locating the most famous outlaw of the Old West in a first-hand account published in 1882 with complete clarity. It was not an epic and continuous pursuit through wild terrain. It was the patient and methodical exploitation of a human contact network, people who had seen Billy in certain locations, who knew where he usually took shelter, who had personal reasons to help or to inform. Billy the Kid's death happened in a completely dark room at 12:11 in the morning, with no drama whatsoever and no duel of any kind. The exact opposite of any scene Hollywood would choose to film. The smoke from a small, deliberately contained campfire rises in an uneven spiral in the afternoon wind that's beginning to die down. You're in a valley between two low hills, away from any trail visible from above, with the horse tied a few yards away. The leather of the saddle still holds the heat of the hours at a gallop. The dust of the flight is caked into every fold of your clothes. The muscles of your thighs and back ache with that specific pain of someone who spent hours in a forced position without rest. And for the first time since it all started, you stop completely. You take a deep breath, and you realize with a clarity that stings that you are completely alone, and that this probably won't change for a long time. That moment, the first night of a fugitive, when the adrenaline begins to fade and the reality of the new situation asserts itself with full force, was frequently described by those who survived long enough to give any account as the hardest moment of the entire experience, not necessarily because of any immediate physical threat, but because of the emotional and cognitive realization of everything that had changed permanently and irreversibly. The day-to-day life in the Old West of an outlaw had one defining characteristic that transcended hunger, physical danger, and accumulated exhaustion: absolute solitude as a permanent condition of existence. A wanted man couldn't afford real emotional bonds of any kind. Every person who entered his life, fellow criminal, childhood friend, distant family member, passing acquaintance, carried the concrete potential to destroy him, whether through calculated opportunism, pressure from the law, deliberate betrayal, or simply out of fear of the consequences of harboring him. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, perhaps the most widely romanticized pair of outlaws in all of Old West history, immortalized in celebrated film productions, are frequently portrayed as loyal, inseparable friends facing the world together with lightness and genuine camaraderie. But the documented reality of the hole-in-the-wall gang was structurally different. Researcher Charles Kelly in The Outlaw Trail describes an organization marked by systematic mutual distrust, frequent betrayals, and constant membership turnover as members were arrested, killed in confrontations, or simply disappeared when conditions shifted in their favor. Butch Cassidy maintained his leadership position not through romantic charisma, but through a functional paranoia that protected him. He knew that any one of his men was capable of turning him in at any moment for a governor's pardon or a sufficiently attractive reward, and betrayal was, by far, the most documented primary cause of capture among Old West bandits. Not the superior skill of law enforcement agents, not tracking technology, not the numerical superiority of the pursuers. Betrayal by people close to them. A gang member who coldly calculated that the reward for your name was worth more than any loyalty built over months of shared life. A woman you'd spent a night with who recognized your face on a poster weeks later. An innkeeper who had sheltered you and who decided, when his own business ran into trouble, that reporting your whereabouts was the most convenient solution. The outlaws who managed to survive for longer periods understood that dynamic early. Jesse James was deeply paranoid about any new member joining the gang, and it was exactly a relatively new member, Robert Ford, who shot him in the back in April of 1882, lured by the promise of legal immunity and a $10,000 reward, a fortune at the time. Belle Starr, the only woman documented as a leader of criminal operations during the period, was murdered in February of 1889, and the identified suspects were all people from her innermost circle of trust. For you, in the first hours of the night, that weight became impossible to ignore. If you had companions in the flight, the time had come for an analysis that admitted no romanticism. Could you trust them if there was a substantial reward on your name? The honest answer, based on what history records time and again, was probably not, and definitely not forever. The cold of the nights on the Great Plains was yet another factor that the films ignore, with a consistency that borders on narrative dishonesty. Nights on the prairies of the Texas Territory and New Mexico could drop to below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even after days with suffocating heat above 100 degrees. The temperature swing was extreme and rapid. A campfire large enough to provide real warmth was a beacon visible for miles, an open invitation to any pursuer who happened to be in the territory. A fire too small didn't produce enough heat to sleep with any basic level of quality, and sleeping in the open, on the hard ground of the prairie, without proper gear and without a camp set up with the right means, was a brutally efficient lesson in the dangers of the Old West that no rookie fugitive was ever truly prepared to absorb in practice. The smell of the cold, damp earth at night, the howls of coyotes in the distance sounding close enough to be unsettling, the creak of the horse's tack every time the animal shifted. Every sound was an alarm, every shadow was a threat, every hour of the early morning seemed longer than the one before, and when sleep finally came, exhausted, fragmented, full of starts, it didn't rest anything. It only prepared the body for one more day of running that had no visible end on the horizon. These men that films transformed into romantic heroes of the American West were, in the overwhelming majority, ordinary people destroyed by wrong choices in brutal circumstances, victims of an economic and social system that offered them no real alternatives, prisoners of a life that had promised freedom and delivered only exhaustion, fear, and premature death. The history of the Old West is genuinely fascinating precisely because, beneath all the myth built up over more than a century of popular entertainment, There is a human reality that is far more complex, far more tragic, and far more honest than any Hollywood screenplay would be willing to tell an audience that paid to be entertained. The outlaw life was not freedom. It was a prison without walls, built brick by brick out of hunger, distrust, loneliness, and exhaustion, with no expiration date in sight. Now tell me, if you were living the first 24 hours as a fugitive in the real Old West, what would be your biggest obstacle? The relentless hunger and thirst of the road, the total loneliness that wouldn't let you trust anyone, the constant fear of being betrayed by whoever you called an ally, or the brutal reality of weapons that movies never truly show? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which part of this video surprised you the most. If this look at the history of the American West changed the way you see the real Old West, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we're going to dive into another brutal and forgotten aspect of everyday life on the American frontier, something that books rarely tell honestly. Don't miss it.